Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
And please welcome Zachary Elwood, or is it Zach, I believe, that you like to go by to the podcast?
Fine. Yeah, Zach's great. I'm not picky.
All right, Zach. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Oh, doing good, yeah. How are you?
Doing good, yeah. We appreciate your time. And like I told you, the first question I wanted to jump into and have a conversation about what you do is, you have a focus on poker, and you wrote the book Poker Tells, and among the other books that you wrote, and you talk about the psychology kind of behind poker. So why I decided to start talking about politics and polarization and, those sort of serious topics. Do you not like joy in your life, or tell us about that?
Yeah, it's the story of how I got into it, I would say, is, I wanted to create the podcast as a follow-up to my Poker Tells work, and because I was thinking of something like, well, what else can I do? Because I was pretty much done on the Poker Tells front. I'd written 3 books. I created a video series, and I didn't have much more to say. But obviously, there's an incentive to do something else. So I created this behavior psychology podcast, and then more I thought about the political stuff. I started out very polarized myself. Like, I would post like insulting things about Trump supporters. A few years ago, I would say some pretty bad things. Looking back on it, and the more I thought about things, the more I started seeing the reasons why people would vote for Trump, and why for example, why they thought liberals were condescending and arrogant and had bad ideas. So I just started examining the understandable reasons, even if I disagreed with a lot of the stances, but understanding kind of the dynamics, and got interested in the dynamics and seeing people fight online, because I was interested. I wrote a piece and spent several weeks researching and writing a piece about kind of the inherent ways that internet communication and social media amplify divides. And I was focusing on the inherent mechanisms, not the product choice kind of stuff, which often gets the focus. So doing that led me into other related work about, does social media increase polarization, us versus them feelings, political polarization. So I kind of went down that rabbit hole and started having people on the podcast that had researched that question. And yeah, the more I thought about it, I came to see our tendency to form into these angry us versus them groups as kind of like the key human problem, and not just, obviously not just America, but, throughout history, other countries currently, polarization is increasing in the world, and it just seems a human nature problem that will probably, end up being the end of us one day or another, with bigger and bigger weapons, more and more advanced weapons. It just seems we have a natural tendency to kind of form into these high anger groups and insult each other and anger each other and drive the tensions up more and more, which distorts our beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how I got into it, was just through Poker Tells, behavior psychology, and then the interest in the psychology that we see around us with the us versus them dynamics.
Yeah, it's like I'm so surprised when I hear people get out of their own bubbles, themselves and their group things like that. And but I kind of did it myself as well. I was on the other side of that coin. I was that Trump supporter, probably posting nasty stuff online or whatever about people like you were posting nasty stuff about people like me back at that time.
Yep.
And, after the 2016 election, I've told the story many times, is that I essentially looked around and said, well, I voted for Trump, and that was supposed to help things, but nothing is getting easier or better in the country. And it's, quite the opposite. It's getting worse. And, that seems to be some of the big tipping points behind a lot of independent organizations. We talk about people we find like you that have find that same process right after the 2016 election. What so you kind of found that path yourself. Would you say it was more through the interviews you did on your podcast and the psychology you found with these people?
I'd say it really sparked from, like you were saying, these personal interactions I had, including with like friends and family members, acquaintances online, where we would say horrible things to each other. And I'm like, this really seems a part of the problem. Like, these are things we would say to each other that we just wouldn't say in person, when we're more generous and we have more nuance, and we're not just like making statements at each other and trying to prove the other person wrong. And that's really how I got interested in it, was these kind of personal things, and also seeing people, in my political group on my side who would say really horrible things, and being like, well, that's clearly not helping, and how much am I doing that kind of stuff, and how much are even politicians and journalists doing this kind of stuff, just this kind of tribal stuff that just makes things worse, as you say. Because I'm a big believer, the pitch that I always give to people about this, who, people who care about political issues on one side or the other, or, whatever their political views is, you can see how the us versus them dynamics get worse and contribute to our problems, while believing a wide range of specific political things. Like you and me, like, we'd probably disagree on a lot of stances, but it's like, I can understand how you see things that way, and that's the important thing to me. It's almost like seeing the problem as the emotion and the anger, and focusing less on, what is the right thing, because clearly we can all, like, hugely disagree. Rational and well-meaning people can disagree on a wide range of topics. Like, even just take the trolley problem in philosophy. It's like people can reach such different conclusions about what the right thing to do is for such simple things. And I think focusing on that a lot more is key to it, and not focusing on, like, well, I know I'm right, you must be a bad person to think something differently,
Right, and it's amazing how we just assume so much assumption when we talk to people and see the things on Twitter like that, and Facebook, and if you're against abortion, then you must be on the left, right? You must be blue. And if you're pro-life, then you must be on the left, things like that. And it's like, there's no nuance in anything we do anymore. And so did you find nuance within some of your conversations with your podcast guests, or within your friends, after you've learned this stuff?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've tried to have tough conversations for the podcast, even about specific issues. For example, police violence. I've had several conversations on that. I've had a conversation about trans issues. And I think what I'm trying to do, and probably what you all are trying to do too, and some other organizations, people are trying to do, that I think is important, is have the tough conversations from a depolarization perspective, right? Like, it's easy to have the conversations where you're just arguing about who's right and what making scoring points. Like, everybody does that, but I think the harder thing to do is have those conversations where you acknowledge the better points of whatever side, for the trans episode, for example, the trans issues episode, my goal with that, because my audience is predominantly politically liberal, my goal was to show them some of the better points of the conservative side arguments, or just anybody who's criticizing liberal side arguments. It doesn't have to be conservatives, and show them, like, it doesn't have to be the people who have those objections are not all hateful bigots. There can be reasonable arguments and rational arguments to be had. So that's partly what I've been trying to do with the podcast, and with the book I'm writing, where, and it's a really hard thing, like, as I'm sure it's like, because as soon as you try to have those tough conversations, there are people that interpret your willingness to see those points of view as you supporting those points of view, right? Because
Right.
And when you have a lot of emotion, which a lot of people do, obviously, on these topics, it's perceived, even trying to say, like, look at the better points, even if you disagree with them, is perceived as like, well, you're helping them by pointing that out. You must be on their side by pointing that out. Whereas I'm definitely not. Like, I have a wide range of, it's not easy to fit my views in any specific category. So it's, to me, the important thing is just being able to see what people believe and why they believe it and how they've come to believe it, and kind of see the benefit of speaking in respectful and de-escalating ways, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the psychological thing behind a retweet in Twitter even, right? It's like people always think, well, if you retweet something that you must agree with it, right? Versus like, just look at this. And
Right.
You have to put comments on top of that, of course, to make sure why you're retweeting it. And so people understand, like, I'm not retweeting this because I agree with it. It's because maybe just take a look at this. What do you think about it?
Right.
For this, with people that follow me, and I have a problem with the word follower as well, but,
or even not even more than that. It's like by retweeting someone that you just happen to see, you know nothing about them, and then they're like, well, you must be on board with that person's politics, like everything
Right.
else they've said, which we see a lot of that too. And it's like, I've gotten that a little bit myself. Even just sometimes I follow people, and I've had people that I know be like, how do you follow that person? They've said such horrible things. I'm like, I am not on Twitter that much. Like, I have no idea what you're even talking about. Like, I don't know everything this person has said. So I think there's, we filter things through the worst possible, interpretation, where we hold each other accountable for all these associated things, because we've become a little bit more paranoid and super pessimistic about, what everything means, right?
Right. And it's like, why do you think, like in sports, that coaches watch game film of the other team? It's so they know what to plan for when they're playing them, right? So if you love the groupthink thing idea and you want to fight the other group, then don't you want to know what they're doing?
Right. Yeah. It's like,
at least,
and that's what I say too. It's like, even if your only goal listening to my work or other, kind of de-escalation aimed work, even if your main goal is, fighting the other side and getting your policies passed or whatever, you have political aims, isn't it valuable to understand other people better, and it helps you form more persuasive arguments. But I think the problem is, a lot of people simply just aren't that interested in persuasion. We kind of assume that people are, but I think in actuality, there's for people with a lot of anger, they just feel like the persuasion is past. Like there's no persuasion to be had, because you're just fighting people that are, purely bad, and but they forget about, even if you believe that's true, what about, clearly the other side is not monolithic. There's people on the other side that disagree and fight amongst themselves. So when you forgo the persuasion tactics, you're basically just being like, well, we'll let all the people on the other side become as bad as the people we perceive on the other side. Whereas, like, if you want to get your stuff passed or accomplish your goals, you should be interested in persuading the people who are in disagreement on the other side. Even if you think whatever percentage of people on the other side you think that are capable of being persuaded, like, shouldn't you want to persuade them?
Right. Yeah. I'm curious, what's something that has kind of changed your stance with your conversations around the psychology behind polarization? Is there anything you can think of where you thought one thing and now after these conversations you've kind of changed your mind on it? Or
that's a good question. I mean, I think I've sometimes thought about putting together my, like, several kind of like aha, moments about how I thought about polarization. And there were a few, like when I, at the beginning stages, even just delving into, like, the differences as studied between ideological polarization versus, emotional, us versus them feeling polarization, and kind of trying to separate those two, but also see how they're related. That was very interesting, and delving into some of the rabbit holes around that. And then recently, just thinking, well, a recent kind of aha thing was even just thinking about the language I use and other people use about these things. For example, I use depolarization a lot as, but I've come to think, in just in the last few days, that I don't think it's a very persuasive argument, because people will perceive it. Getting back to that overlap between ideological polarization and emotional polarization, people perceive the word depolarization as if you're trying to depolarize their ideas, right? It's like, you want me to move towards the middle, whereas like I've been thinking about it. I'm too close to it maybe, and I'm thinking about it like I'm trying to reduce your anger, your affective emotional polarization, but it's perceived as like we're trying to get you to move your stances to the middle, whereas like, and that's so I start, I occasionally will like reevaluate the entire effort and be like, need more persuasive language on my part to show people like it's not about changing your stances. It's about other things, like reducing distorted views of the other side and not seeing the other side as all the same. And it's about seeing how anger makes things worse, and contributes to the very things you're angry about. Things like this.
Right, because too often people say, well, if you're trying to move me to the center, then there's no opinions in the center. Nobody cares in the center, right?
Right.
So
you
must
want to
not care
reduce
about anything.
you want to reduce my passion. Basically, it's perceived that it's like you want me to reduce my passion because you're a weird centrist who just wants to make peace and doesn't actually care about anything. Like that can be the perception, right? Whereas like,
Right.
that is not at all what I'm saying, but that is so often the response I get. So it's making me rethink, kind of my personal approach and language used. And it might be that's why. It might be that other people realize that, so maybe that's why other people weren't using the depolarization term as much as I've been. Yeah.
Yeah, how can you just where's the button to just flip it all off, right? Can you just depolarize everybody, and then and then are we back to this? Like, I heard this in one of your podcasts. I was kind of surprised to hear this. Your interview with Andrew O'Donoghue, that it's like a Goldilocks problem with too little polarization in the 1950s. That the political scientists came out and said that American political parties are not polarized enough back then. I was so surprised to hear that, in the 50s.
That's an interesting. I feel like somebody could write a whole book just on, how the divides have changed, because, yeah, back in those days, the political there was conflict, and very significant conflict, but it wasn't aligned with the political parties, right? It's like the political parties were almost sort of like a social club, like everybody was just getting along, and there were like a range of stances, that you could find on either side. And so the conflicts were elsewhere, for example, like, racial conflicts in the South and those kind of stances, or, generational, like I've talked to my dad about this, who, was kind of a, I wouldn't say hippie, but in that mentality in the 60s,
Yeah.
and I was asking him, like, well, did you all think in terms of like political parties, because that I knew at that point that wasn't really a focal point, and he's like, no, nobody ever talked about like Democrats and Republicans. We just hated like the system, and the system was comprised of like a range of politicians, just the Democrats and Republicans, and just like the people that were doing the bad things, right? Vietnam War, or other things, racial things, which was spread out amongst the political parties. So yeah, I think that would be a really fascinating book, and it's possible somebody's written about that. But basically, like, examining where exactly the divides were in those times, and then like, yeah, how it became shifted over to the parties.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about it like that, but I mean, I have before, but it's like, was there just not enough news coverage with the World War II? I'm sure there was a lot of news coverage, but what if Vietnam had attacked in America? Would everybody then been okay with the war? I mean, probably a little more, right? But when did it change? When did people start going left and right and loving their political parties more. Like, can we find the root cause? Is there a root cause,
Yeah, I think it's just this sorting of like you can it's all these factors. I mean, actually, a good book where he talks about the many factors involved in this kind of sorting polarization dynamic is Peter Coleman's book, The Way Out. And Peter Coleman's a respected conflict resolution person, and he writes in there, which I think is true. We often try to find these kind of like root causes, and like magic bullets of like, oh, what caused this? What and he points out like it's basically all of these various. It's like a storm, it's like a tornado forming. It's just like all of these things kind of like working with each other. So it's really hard to pinpoint things, because as soon as you pinpoint one thing, you're like, well, that's connected to this thing over there, and it's just this storm of self-sorting. I mean, I would view it as like
whack-a-mole.
Yeah, kind of a centrifuge too. It's like the self-sorting stuff, because it's like, one thing leads to another. Like as soon as the political parties people in the political parties start taking on certain traits, and they start perceiving each other as different, there's just this self-reinforcing effect where you're like, well, I don't want to be like them, who I think are, so it's just kind of like a ball rolling faster and faster downhill and taking on more and more of a life of its own. But yeah, it's a complex dynamic for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so what have you learned that didn't change? What's the best thing you've learned about polarization with your podcast and the people you talked about? Like, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it, getting worse, so much like right now? Like,
yeah, I'll answer. Yeah, so I'll answer the getting worse, and then talk about one of the most interesting things I learned. There's some paper from a couple years ago that I quote at the beginning of the book I'm working on that basically says something like, it's really hard to know how these things go. It's a chaotic system. It's hard to know, like, are we at a point where we're going to see more polarization? Are we going to see a point where it kind of dies off? Like, it's really hard to predict that. And I think that, I would say that points to the value of being uncertain and having some humility about these things, because the thing I often see is like people being kind of like too certain and a bit arrogant in their positions, where it's like, we're going to have civil war, or the opposite, where it's like, this isn't a problem and everybody's overreacting, and it's like, we can acknowledge that these things could get worse or get better. Like we don't really know. I think it's valuable to avoid these over certain views, like in the sense that people who talk about like, oh, we're going to have a civil war, which you see this kind of stuff a lot, or we saw this a little bit in the last elections, the midterm elections, where everybody was like, oh, the Republicans are all going to deny the elections and we're just going to crumble into nothingness. And it's like, I was like, well, wait and see. I don't think that's going to happen, like, and I think there is a danger and a badness to being overly pessimistic and confident on those things, because you create a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic where you start thinking like, well, we're going to have a civil war, so we should do this, and the other side's like, well, yeah, they're saying we're going to have a civil war, so we should do this, and there's just like an escalation aspect. It's like it's okay to be uncertain while you think about worst case scenarios and not speak as if you're certain about such things. So I think and I talked to somebody, Thomas Zaitzoff, a political researcher, about that, because he was someone who was criticizing, these kind of like confident Civil War pronouncements, and he had done some work on that. But to your point about like one of the most interesting things I've done or learned about polarization for the podcast was a talk with Matthew Hornsey, who's a respected group psychology researcher, and had a really great conversation with him. It was one of the most popular episodes from last year. And I had basically had this inkling of an idea that was basically like, the more and more I thought about the polarization problem, the solution to me, like when it came to like, what are we asking people to do, right? Like, what are we asking regular citizens to do? To me, it boiled down to getting people to me be more willing to criticize divisive and unreasonably divisive and hateful rhetoric on their side, in their own political group, because it seemed to me you had no influence over the other group. Your group was the only group that you could speak to and influence. And I brought that idea up to Matthew Hornsey, and I hadn't really seen much about it and one of the reasons I want to talk to him was actually just ask him his point on this idea I had, and he pointed me to research I didn't even know about that showed yes, there's research showing that when you criticize your side and examine the nuance and examine misgivings about what your side is doing, that actually lowers the anger in the other group. And they had studies on this in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. They have studies in some other context, I can't remember where, but that to me was kind of an aha moment too, because it really made me think, what are we trying to get people to do? We're not just trying to get people to be nice to each other. We're trying to get people to reduce the us versus them rhetoric. And how do we do that? You can't get the other side to reduce their us versus them rhetoric. You have to talk to people that are politically aligned with you and help them see your expressed anger and angry rhetoric and insulting rhetoric are exactly what's driving this thing and helping create some of the things that you yourself are angry about. And so that's kind of in a nutshell, that's kind of what my book is trying to do, is helping people see how the anger is not some side thing. The anger is helping drive the very things that upset us. So yeah, I think that's very important.
That's a good idea. It's a good way to think about that, I guess. Because I was technically a Republican. I never joined it, but I basically left the right, and I'm in the middle now, technically. And it depends on what we talked about. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I lean maybe a little left, and maybe I usually lean right on most things. But is that trying to be the parent in the room too much to tell everybody, you have to find things you agree with? Should people stay on their side to do what you just said there, and get everybody else to say, hey, look, we're fighting too much right now, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's tough because as you say, as soon as people try to do those things, they will be perceived as not in the group or such, or they'll be perceived as part of the problem. But I do think, and I think there's a lot about the approach too, where it's not I think an important part of it is pointing out these polarization dynamic ideas and saying, I'm not criticizing you for any ideological reason or but the subtext, the meta point is, can you see that it's not about what you believe, it's about how you're expressing it, right? So that's a very complex, nuanced point to point out in a quick way, right? Because you're trying to say it's about the emotions that we're expressing and not about you can express a wide range of political spectrum ideas in a respectful manner, right? So it is a challenge, as you say, because I think it's hard for a reason, right? There's a reason we don't do these things, because we don't speak up about bad, unhelpful behaviors on our side because it's exhausting, because we don't want to be thought of as traitors. We just don't want to deal with it too, and we may think we may not be sure. We may think we're actually hurting our political group and helping the other side by doing these things. Whereas I would say, I think it's counterintuitive, because I think it's our apathy. It's our fear of speaking up about our own group's transgressions that are precisely how polarization gets worse. So the in-group criticism, as it's called in the research, is kind of like a tamping down, like a cooling mechanism for a nuclear reaction. So we're just getting more people to be I'm actually hopeful on this stuff, because I think it's actually easier than people think. Because I think we've all had experiences probably where we see somebody we know, friend or family member, who's pretty politically aligned with us, and we probably we've a lot of us have had that experience of saying like, hey, that's not really a good point. Maybe you should rethink that, or maybe you shouldn't have shared this thing without researching it. You were wrong, and you don't want to look like an idiot. And like, I think the more people do those kinds of things, it actually creates a pretty good cultural change pretty quickly, because I've seen that in people I know. Like, I don't think I've had like a big effect or anything, but even just in the people who I personally know, who, like my family members or whatever, who listen to my stuff, I mean, I think it's helped them take a more nuanced view, and it helped them realize maybe the thing I'm sharing out of anger really quickly isn't nuanced, is just adding to anger of the people they know. So I think I actually am more optimistic than a lot of people, in the sense that I think people are too pessimistic about the power that we all have to change cultural dynamics. I think things can change quickly, as we've seen, like in any country's cultural history. There's sometimes things just change quickly if enough people get on board with them and try to spread it, right? And that to me actually is easier than people think. It's like people perceive we're up against some like, oh, things can't change, everything's just screwed up. But it's like, all it takes is X amount of like some critical limit or some critical mass of people. And I don't think it's that much sometimes, because we all can influence multiple people around us, right? So I'm actually optimistic in those senses, in that sense, because I do think cultural change sometimes can happen more quickly than we tend to think.
Yeah, and then you talk about polarization. Polarization is a problem across the world, not just in the U.S. I know. Is the U.S. the worst country with polarization right now? Probably not. I would imagine, if you like, we can think about countries like North Korea, where they couldn't stop it, and now they don't have any. They only have one side right now.
Yeah, or the polarization is repressed. Yeah, it's
right.
Well, that if people are interested in that conversation I had with Andrew O'Donoghue, who's studied polarization around the world, was an interesting talk, because one, polarization has been measured to be increasing in most of the countries in the world, and then two, and these things are nuanced too. It's there's always room for debate, because it's like they've measured polarization in different ways in different countries, and then like but then one thing in that area is, they say, the United States has been that their polarization has been increasing at a faster rate, which I think we've seen, with after Trump's election and such. It's just kind of like ramped up a lot. So yeah, I think as you point out, it is important to recognize that this is not. I think we tend to focus so much in America and be like America myopic, where everything is filtered through, thinking that our fights or our polarization, our us versus them anger is kind of unique, and that it's all about this American dynamic or something, where it's like, no, you can have these same dynamics on many different issues, on many different factors, but the underlying behaviors, the drifting to the outside, and the becoming increasingly dehumanizing to the other group, is the same. It's been studied in many countries, and it's happened many times throughout history. Even let's take a to really get into the tough question, is like, a lot of people will be like, well, what about Nazi Germany? The Nazis were just bad. But you look at, if anyone actually looks into the history of what led up to the Nazis, there was a lot of leftist, communist, violence in the streets. Like, one of the reasons it was easy for Hitler or the people on that side to form these groups, that these bad groups, was because it was like they were able to paint a convincing picture of the leftist violence, like bombings of places and such. It's like, but I think in a lot of people's perspectives, they tend to think like, well, sometimes just bad groups come out of nowhere and do stuff. It's like,
take over.
It's a lot more complex than that. Like, you can find writings by progressive people who have studied the historians who write about how fighting back in pre-Nazi Germany, how the decision from some of these people to go out and fight the Hitler group in the streets was like what helped the Hitler stance become prominent, because then they could paint this picture of like these people came out and fought us in the streets. I mean, it has mappings over to why I would tell people about the Antifa kind of stuff of like fighting police. It's like or going out to fight Proud Boys in the streets. I'm like, you are actively helping the extreme group on the other side because they are able to paint, a convincing picture about how there's this huge violent conflict going on and somebody has to choose a side, right? So
Right.
I think that's what people don't get, is that even for these situations that can seem like it's all about one side, if you look at the dynamics that led up to that, there was, and I'm not saying all the time, I mean, sometimes there's, but we're talking about the predominant cases and the mode of polarization. It's, there's these dynamics where it's an escalation, right? And I think that's what people need to realize. And if you're, progressive, liberal listening to this, and you're curious what I'm talking about, read Erica Edelson's book, Beyond Contempt. She's a very progressive person who writes about the insulting rhetoric from the left and like how that contributed to Donald Trump's election, or read Richard Rorty's book, Achieving Our Country, and he's a progressive person who was basically criticizing the pessimism of the left and the divisive kind of rhetoric of the left and how that might lead to pushback from the right, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I think on both sides, if you're on one side or the other, it really pays to examine these dynamics and understand them, because I think understanding them when you delve into them will help you see the conflicts in a more clear way, at the very least, like whether you do anything about it. And I also think it'll make you happier too, because you can kind of understand, when you understand these things better, you can understand even the people you think are unreasonable and angry, you can understand those dynamics and give them a little bit more slack too, and see there's reasons for why they're the way they are, and even if you think they're being very unhelpful and unreasonable. And so I think, and I've talked to people who listen, to my stuff, including my wife, who, I helped be increasingly kind of less angry about politics over the last few years. And, she's like, it's made me a much happier person because I'm not filtering everything through the most pessimistic filter. And I'm trying to, see the why of people's reasonings and not just like jump to the worst possible conclusion.
Right. Because, we're all humans at the end of the day, and we're all, usually there's at least something we would agree with. We all want to have good health, and our kids to grow up, be healthy and happy, and have a little bit of money to work with. We can agree on a few things with each human. And like you were mentioning with Nazi Germany, like that started with World War One, and their economy was destroyed, and that left that vacuum for that polarization to take place. And people needed something to fight, some reason to blame, something to blame everything on. And that is also one of the dynamics that led to that. And that's what I worry about a little bit. I'm one of those people that thinks eventually we'll have a war between the right and left, potentially, in America. And I worry about, we just like to have an enemy in the U.S. And like after World War II, that was a huge fight, and obviously that took a lot of time to get out of. And then, eventually it got a little bad, like we were talking about, in the 70s, and then it cooled off in the 80s. But it was probably getting worse into the 2000s until we hit 9/11. And 9/11, for me, gave us a national enemy to go fight for a while. And I think then, after a while, into the 2007s, and then, 8 and 9, as the economy plunged, now we can look at each other again and say, well, I need an enemy, so let's look over here, inside of our borders. And I think
Yeah.
that's also part of the problem. We always need an enemy.
No, I think you're right. There, like it's easy for me to imagine if we didn't have World War II, like we would have just been polarized that much earlier or whatever. These things, as you say, kind of give a focus outside of the country and let us, you know, it's kind of a post shock to war too, where you're like, oh my God, what have we done? We need to really rethink, our entire, be nice to each other for at least for a while, right?
Right.
So
We're all Americans. We're all New Yorkers, in New York at the time,
right,
that kind of thinking. Yeah.
but I think you're right. It's like, unfortunately, and that's what people have said. Like, unfortunately, it may require something like that for us to get better, which is a really sad, a sad thing. And it may, yeah, it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. And within that, I mean, do you think you're making a dent with what you're talking about? I noticed one of the reviews you posted about your podcast on Twitter, spineless trash attempting a both sides grift. Like that person doesn't think you're making a dent, but yeah, do you think you are?
Well, I don't think I'm doing, I don't think I'm making a big dent. But my stance is, I think it takes all of us doing pieces of this work, right? Like, even if I do a small thing, if I'm reaching, I reach a few thousand people with my podcast who listen consistently, and then I have my, friends and family. I'm like, even if I reached even much less than that, I think it's worthwhile because it's like I said, I feel like we just need more people doing that work. It's not, and I like to say, as I emphasize in my book, it's like I don't think I have the right answers or think I have a amazing approach. It's more like I just think we need more people doing it, and then that
Yeah.
encourages more people to do it too, and that includes some more powerful people, right? Like influencers, political influencers, and journalists. The more people talk about these things, because I just feel like people just don't. First, it's strangely not talked about to me. That the fact that we know about how often these things happen and how the dynamics happen, and but you don't see people talking about it for very understandable reasons too, because that's kind of the fundamental nature of polarization. It makes people not it makes people less likely to take a bridge building approach, right? It's just kind of a
Right.
fundamental aspect of it. That's why it gets worse. It's all related. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't think I'm making a big dent, but I think we just need many people making small dents.
Yeah, and I saw on Twitter again you were looking trying to find a better word for this, right? For depolarization. Did you figure out a better word yet for that?
Well, I knew I was forgetting some common words, like people mentioned de-escalation, which is okay, like,
Hmm.
but I still think there's a better. I'm still trying to think of like how I'm going to word it in my book and replace some of the words, but yeah, like I was saying, I don't think the depolarization word is that persuasive for the reasons I mentioned. I think it has to be more like anger reduction or something like that. Oh, but yeah, getting back to that review, I think that bad review. I mean, that's the interesting thing too, is like the polarization dynamic. And you can look in any country, like this is always the same dynamic. If you look at any country that's highly polarized, the bridge builders, the people trying to depolarize things, take a lot of abuse, from people on both sides and people who just think they're weak and cowardly. So, and when it comes to building, I think one of the challenges to the depolarization work is that it lacks a sexy narrative. It lacks an exciting narrative because it's
Right.
exciting to fight things, right? It's exciting to like fight evil for whatever any side of an issue for whatever you believe in. We all have the narratives about like fighting and war and winning, but we don't have like exciting, sexy narratives about like bringing people together. And I think but I think if we were going to form something like that, to me, it's about like the bravery required to examine ourselves and examine our biases and examine like these psychological tendencies to that we struggle with, because I think that's really at heart. Like we are fighting a war really, but it's a war in our own psychology and our own psychological tendencies to get into these patterns. So to me, yeah, it's like I think we need to build those narratives about it is an exciting endeavor. To me, it's an exciting endeavor, and I think I try to make other people see it as an exciting endeavor because I think that's part of the how you make it a sticky, something that people will pass to other people, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like I think I heard you mention this before as well, but I always think about this too. It's like with polarization and we're all fighting on these stupid things, like usually like you're left and I'm right. Like, what are we not thinking about? What are we not focusing on? Like, are there aliens here somewhere? And we just wouldn't know it because, we're fighting with our neighbors on how they voted or how we think they voted. And maybe there's an alien in our backyard, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, totally. It's like, that's one of the reasons I view the us versus them polarization as one of the main human problems, because not only can it escalate to really horrible situations, apart from that, you've got the fact that you're completely not able to focus on things that really matter, right? Like, no matter what you believe they are, it's like we've got serious problems, but the gridlock in Congress, we can't pass anything. We can't actually, like, say we can't like, people on both sides, for example, might feel like we need to do more on the internet and social media, and these things might be dangerous or need to be controlled in certain ways or regulated. People on both sides can have those opinions, but it's like, well, we're too polarized to ever even attempt something like that. And so then, therefore,
Right.
like, that means like Mark Zuckerberg can, do whatever he wants, which, I think on both sides, people would think that's not great. So all these things of like, or infrastructure, for example, all this stuff, it just creates an environment where national debt. It creates an environment where we can't solve problems, right? So that's really, like that movie was. I didn't like that movie very much, where the recent thing of the comet heading to the Earth. It was kind of like a parody of. I thought it was a bit biased for various reasons, but the concept of like there's a meteor heading towards Earth, and we honestly, like, if you're too polarized, you're not going to be able to solve that because you're just going to be fighting over things until the meteor hits you, basically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was what was that? Greenfield? No, was it Green something?
there was some, what was that? Don't Look Up. That's the one I was looking at.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't really enjoy it because I felt it to be kind of just like insulting about like, look at these stupid conservatives kind of thing.
Okay,
I thought
yeah,
it was a bit,
I remember that one.
it's like, yes, conservatives aren't the only ones who, don't really care about certain, environmental issues. Like I thought it was a little too heavy-handed and kind of insulting in that way. I would have written it a little bit differently, but I
Right.
feel like depolarization aimed people should like they should send scripts to us, and we can like revise them to help them make them more persuasive to a wider audience. I feel like
Right.
If any Hollywood script writers are watching, send me some scripts, and I'll help you reach a wider audience.
That's great. Well, you brought up movie, so I have to ask. Like Flight of the Navigator over Interstellar?
Well, that was a joke.
What are you talking about?
I thought that was funny. Yeah, I just watched that the other night. I hadn't seen it since I was a kid, and I was like, it's got the speed of light, the not aging. It's got thoughts about the AI robot. I was just kind of mapping them over.
Yeah, I saw that on Twitter. I said I gotta ask because I love Interstellar. That's one of my favorite movies.
I didn't like it, but I didn't like it. I didn't dislike it that much as I was joking around.
Yeah. Well, then maybe final thought and question that I have, and I don't know if you follow or listen to Eric Weinstein at all. He was on Rogan recently, Joe Rogan, and he believes that like things like polarization can't be solved at all, and we need to leave this world. We need to get out of here, and everybody, we don't need to go to Mars. We need to find another, Earth, basically somewhere
Really?
to leave. Yeah, he believes we can't do anything now because we have things like Russia and China and North Korea. And we're just making things worse here in America, and we're eventually going to be in World War III, and we all have the nuclear buttons. We're going to hit them. And it's just a matter of time, whether it's 5 years or 10 years. Elon trying to get us to Mars is great, but that's not enough. And he would love to talk to Elon and get, to an actual new world somewhere. I don't know if you've seen that.
I did not know.
That idea, or yeah.
I mean, I am pessimistic in the sense that, like, I do believe that our tendency to be angry at each other is a fundamental human problem, and it's only going to become more dangerous with new advanced weapons. Like, for example, the man-made disease aspect. Like, people talk a lot about climate change or nuclear war. Like, to me, the man-made disease aspect of weapons is much more scary. Like the fact that you could easily have people making diseases in their garage in a few years, something like that. So I think, and that's just what we know about. Like, there's going to be new weapons that, like, maybe somebody could create a black hole, in their lab or something. So I think,
right.
I think people, in that sense, I am pessimistic. So I sort of agree with them, but at the same, I'm not like one of these people who are like, we need to get to another planet. That's like, if we're that damaged as a people, like, that we are just going to destroy ourselves, like, do we really need to get to another planet? It's just going to end. Like, what do I care if we get to another planet or not? It's all. I'm not in the future. I don't know. This whole thing of, like, we need to sustain things. I'm like, why? I don't. I guess I don't care about the concept of, like, the human race needs to survive. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, if it does, it does. I don't know. It's great if it does, I guess. But we seem to be just, if we're going to escape to another planet, we're just going to polarize over there and fight each other over there. It's just going to.
That's a great point.
It doesn't really solve the fundamental problem. So maybe if Eric Weinstein could get more on board with, like, solving polarization and seeing that as, like, the real threat, and not just escaping to another planet where you're going to have another nuclear war over there. Maybe maybe you can make that pitch to him.
Right. Who's going to stop everybody from shipping their weapons?
Or we're just we're going to end up, like, destroying a peaceful alien civilization, like, 1,000 years from now. We're the villains. It's like, maybe we should have just let ourselves die.
Right. If we move, just because we moved, it doesn't mean we're not mad at each other still.
Yeah, we didn't solve the root problem. Let's solve the root problem now.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Yeah, I like it. All right, you've mentioned a couple times you're working on a new book. Do you want to talk about what's going on with that, when it's coming out, or still not time yet?
So it's taken, as you'd probably not be surprised to learn, it's taking longer than I expected. I expected to have it out in February last month, and then I basically decided to, like, completely rework it because, as you'd imagine, like, you keep like having new thoughts and seeing things from a different perspective. So I actually really want to simplify it, and kind of, like, I wrote it in kind of like a stream of consciousness way, and then now I'm, like, kind of not happy with that and want it a bit more structured. So yeah, hopefully I'll have it out by, like, June, July, I hope, because I'm just self-publishing, which is what I did with my poker books. And yeah, it's good. It's going all right. Like, I know what I want to do. It's just being unhappy with how I've done it so far, basically.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely look for that and make sure everybody knows when it's coming out.
Oh, it's and if they want to check out the website, which the most interesting thing about the website is just that I've compiled all the books that I've read that helped form my opinions on polarization. And that site's at american-anger.com. And nothing else is really interesting is there except for, like, the compilation of books. And I've given my little, like, blurb about which books I think are most important. So if anybody wants to read books that I recommend on that instead of just, like, waiting for mine, they can check that out.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, and I forgot to ask, have you ever studied, like, Trump or Biden's tells? Like, do you know when they're lying, or are they always lying? Or
no, I don't. I'm actually, like, I criticize a lot of, like, so-called behavior experts who, like, take these kind of, like, oh, you can tell, because the research shows that it's really hard to do lie detection. Like, there's so many factors involved, and there's really just not, there's not, like, general, and I've done some podcast episodes about that too, like my interview with Tim Levine, who has criticized a lot of these, like, we can know when people are lying kind of things that people say. But, I think there's other things that are interesting there, because I'm a big believer in kind of statement analysis, as it's called, where there's certain things that people unintentionally say. And if anyone is interested in that, there's an interview I did with Mark McClish, who was a law enforcement trainer on these kinds of behavioral analysis and statement analysis things, and he wrote a great book, I Know You Are Lying. And it's not about, that stuff is much more interesting and information producing, the actual like content of people's verbal statements, but like what they're actually saying, and like some patterns in there, as opposed to like, I think people focus on these like physical behavioral stuff, and there's just so much more interesting stuff in like what people are saying and kind of like hidden meanings in that. And it's still not to say that it's not like it's 100% reliable, but it's like much more interesting than like studying people's like facial tics and stuff like that people do. There's just, poker in like formal sports or games are different, because there's like very specific actions and situations that come up again and again. So it's a more formal environment versus like somebody giving a speech or an interview is like, there's so many factors involved. Like they could look a certain way and just could be like, it could be because their stomach hurts, or like they're remembering, something that was painful, or they're uncomfortable because it's just an uncomfortable to talk about something, and not because they're guilty, So I think there's all these simplistic kind of like basically bullshit behavior experts who just are full of shit, really. I mean, like Jack Brown, I criticize him a lot. He's got a shitload of Twitter followers, and he just spouts bullshit, like clear bullshit, all the time. But because it aligns with people's political, he criticizes conservative stuff and Trump stuff all the time. So because it aligns with people's biases, they love him. They're like, yeah, exactly. They're lying because we don't like them, so we'll agree with your bullshit thing you said about their behavior.
Right.
So there is a lot of that, and he gets a lot of hundreds of thousands of followers just from like aligning with the polarization dynamics.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll mention it again. Everybody should check out your books. You have 3 books: Reading Poker Tells, Verbal Poker Tells, and Exploiting Poker Tells. You have a new book coming out this year, like you just said. Then your podcast is at behavior-podcast.com. Is that correct?
Yeah. And thanks for mentioning all that.
Yeah, and then you're on Medium as well. Is that do you write articles there, or is that just to mention kind of the podcast?
It's I occasionally write things on there. It was like a place to compile like some related some pieces, like the piece I write on social media effects and some other things. But yeah, not very active on there. But really, I think my main form of communication and points on this right now is just the podcast when I do polarization related topics, which is like every 3 episodes or 4 episodes or something.
Yeah. All right. And then on Twitter, a poker player, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Everybody should go there and fight you on Interstellar and make sure that you disagree with you there. Right?
Critique my jokes.
That's right. Yeah. Pretty funny stuff. That's a great follow.
Thanks, Toby.
All right.
No, it's been great talking
Zach,
to you.
Yeah. We appreciate your time. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks for what you do.